Hi, hello, good evening, everyone. Um, I just want to welcome everybody again to Design History Now, which is a series of talks hosted by Bangalore International Centre in collaboration with Phantom Hands. You can return to some of our previous talks hosted on the BIC YouTube channel to find out a bit more about the series and to listen to a much longer introduction to the thinking behind this series as well. Today's talk is from design historian Megha Rajguru, and we'll address how design was used as a mechanism to frame independent India's cultural prowess by the state and by cultural actors in the 1950s, while at the same time being used as a vehicle for social and economic development by a range of stakeholders. Megha is based in Brighton in the UK and is currently principal lecturer and subject lead for history of art and design at the University of Brighton, as well as being the co-director of the Centre for Design History, also at Brighton. Her research covers South Asian design history, material and visual culture, and most recently, she's co-edited the excellent book Design and Modernity in Asia, National Identity and Transnational Exchange from 1945 to 1990. And we're going to share her full bio in the chat once we get started. Megha's talk will be followed by a conversation with Sarita Sundar. Sarita is a designer and design historian based here in Bangalore, though she's recently returned from a Fulbright teaching and research fellowship in the US, during which she was looking at resistances to modernism in India and American design histories. So many thanks again to our audience for being with us today, and we're really looking forward to your questions at the end of the session as well. Over to Megha. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen and thank you for your introduction, Nia. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be speaking to this audience. I've been very much looking forward to meeting in this space of where the South Asia Design History Network has been hosting lots of very exciting talks and events. So I have been introduced here. I just wanted to say that I am the co-director of the Center for Design History, which is a recent formation. It's less than sort of 5 years old, and it is the only center for design history in an academic institution where we are all engaging with lots of discussions on global design histories. And for me, speaking to a group such as yours just shows how much the discipline is becoming much more focused on discussions that are beyond Europe, that are beyond the Euro-American geography. And I hope I have some questions at the end of this to improve my work, to improve my thinking. So this 45-minute long paper will focus on transnational links between UK and India in the first decade or so. So post-independence years, I'm going to try and focus my attention from 1947 to the late 1950s, with a view to address two aspects. One, how the newly independent nation-state employed design as a tool to mark its place in the global cultural and political economies. And secondly, the ways in which the UK featured within this global realm for India and within the global order, particularly in the context of the Cold War. So the first opening slide here shows a photograph in London at the India House, the embassy at Aldwych, and this is 1957. Here, the Prime Minister, as you can see seated, Jawaharlal Nehru, is seen giving a speech under a portrait of Mahatma Gandhi about a decade after his assassination in 1948. The audience is seated on the floor. This photograph of the gathering can be seen in multiple ways. One of the ways in which you could see this is that it is a symbolic representation of India politically in the UK and globally through the image of late Gandhi, which was an image but also represented a set of ideologies that were actively exported in these decolonial years across internationally. And of course, Nehru and their combined political ideas, however misaligned they were in certain areas. Post-independence contexts and the role of embassies is something we also see playing out here in shaping cultural relations. Embassies played a very important role in the formation of heritage and the dialogue for export and import that design would become an important part of. So these two aspects, the image of the representation of Gandhi and Nehru, as well as the embassy, map onto the decolonial relations between India and the UK and help to ask deeper questions around the negotiations of these relationships. So in this paper, I present a methodological framework to understand design history from this period. I will probe into the national discourse on design in India in its broadest sense, so thinking about terms like handicrafts, industrial design, commodities, raw materials for the production of design objects, as these appear in the national archival records, as well as international archival records where there's an exchange with India within the context of the Cold War, and how India's political and cultural movements were perceived from Britain. So Gandhi's ideology and its export beyond India had a particular resonance in the 50s. His speeches and writing on the economics of khadi, the economics of village industries, on women and social injustice, on non-violence, on preparing Indian villages for scientific attitudes, through education, ethics, poverty, and the list is long. So he wrote multiple texts and others wrote multiple texts. In a post-war context, these ideas held currency in colonial nations or the newly decolonized nations. And now we might describe, the kind of the post-colonial or the global South, but also in the first world, quote unquote, first world, as in the European and North American and Northern European nation states. For example, in 1951, the President of India, Dr. Rajendra Prasad, was approached in an international delegates meeting to share knowledge of Gandhian ideas as well as art and craft. He called upon Nehru to support the expansion of knowledge of India through its handicrafts and ancient arts, through a circulation of Gandhian literature via the national missions abroad, including embassies or any diplomatic travels and meetings. The Secretary of State subsequently wrote to the Navjivan Press in Ahmedabad, requesting a list of publications on and by Gandhi for circulation. In addition to this, arts and handicrafts would be shared with a view to increasing trade. So Navjivan Press, and here are a couple of images, sent a 17-page catalogue, and the appendices included lists of books that they had to share. And there was also a report that was produced, which was undertaken by the state to send handicrafts abroad. So this included embroidered designs for walls, brass and copperware, silver and precious metal pieces, carpets, and embroidered textiles or furnishings. So alongside this literature, there were also to be some of these items that were priced up and were to be shared and sent to various embassies. So you can start to see there's a real intertwining of ideology, but also in relation to the material culture, in relation to import, export, how those really translated from philosophy to material culture and through to design. So Gandhi as a national figure and the export of his ideas moved beyond embassies to organizations such as UNESCO. So UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, was established in 1945 and was tasked with promoting international peace through education, scientific and cultural exchange. And the founding director, who was Julian Huxley, a British man, a first president of the British Humanist Association. So this was really important because his perspective in establishing, in his vision for UNESCO really was aligned with this notion of post-war peace and security, human welfare, and I quote, insofar as they can be subserved by the educational and scientific and cultural relations of the people in the world. Accordingly, its outlook must, it seems, be based on some form of humanism. So he was very much concerned by the divisive politics in post-war, in the post-war global order, as well as racism that had ensued in Europe, but also globally. And his philosophy is very much aligned with the philosophies of Gandhi. As such, there were two major UNESCO events held in the early 50s that focused on Gandhian values. An extraordinary session of UNESCO General Conference in Paris, subsequently held in 53, and also in an annual conference in Delhi in 1956. So you can see that over the period of time that these sorts of humanist principles become a central focus. At the 1953 extraordinary meeting in Paris, the Indian delegates participated in approving plans for the UNESCO headquarters in Paris, and the image is on the left of the UNESCO headquarters. Designed by Lucio Costa, who was the Brazilian architect, Walter Gropius, Le Corbusier, Sven Gottfried Markelius, Swedish architect, Ernesto Rogers, Italian architect, and consultant Eero Saarinen, who was a Finnish architect and industrial designer. They were involved in the design of this building. So discussed at this extraordinary meeting included the possibility of programs and projects based on Gandhian ideas for consideration by UNESCO. So what we see is this new building is being designed by a team of people. In this discussion, there is very much an agenda set for how do we now apply some of these ideas that we have been talking about into practice. And this discussion had been going on now since 1949, where the members approved the resolution to undertake preparations of a Gandhian plan to educate international public opinion in the ideas and techniques expounded by Gandhiji for the promotion of non-violence and international understanding. So the difficulties that were experienced over the years, as reported in the papers, was that how can you actually apply these ideas and techniques to European work, to UNESCO work, other than educate the members on the principles? It was agreed that UNESCO would offer opportunities for study with special reference to world peace and international understanding. And the chair of this seminar was Lord Boyd Ose, the one at Paris, and he was a winner of the Nobel Prize for Peace. So this committee, in addition to looking at these designs, in addition to discussing the future plans, were very much committed to stop the two rival blocs, the Eastern and Western blocs in the Cold War context, to be exploiting and dominating the global world order. However, this is also the meeting where Hungary and Czechoslovakia resigned as member states of UNESCO. And this is because the general director of UNESCO stated that, or rather, sorry, this was due to the fact that the two nation states stated that UNESCO was favoring America's interest, and it wasn't fulfilling its promise to extend cultural ties for the cause of peace. So you can see very much as we go along thinking about all of these ideas, that there is always a little bit of a disconnect. There's always a crisis. There is a the alignments of ideas into practice is always tricky in this context. And so this these discussions moved into the 1956 conference in Delhi to paying homage to Gandhi. This context for UNESCO is very important in its subsequent seminars over the years, which promoted crafts and heritage to build bridges across nations. Indian craft and the protection of handloom industries became a frequent concern from the 1960s onwards for both the Indian nation state, but also really promoted by UNESCO. UNESCO's monthly journal Courier regularly featured polemic articles written by cultural voices internationally on the state of culture, arts, and design. One particular journal from 1951 featured articles on India and how past heritage and the arts would pave way for a modern India, one that would be infused by its belief in human values, which was often cited as a unity in diversity and respect for all religions. Another article focused on science and monuments in India, specifically Jantar Mantar in Jaipur and Delhi. And UNESCO would in future shape design, education, and curriculum, as well as policy as developed from exchanges and visits, funding activities, and international ties. So UNESCO played a major hand in the design education at the IIT IDS, for instance. And these early years shed light on how these foundations were laid. So I'm now going to turn to another organization that was squarely located in the realm of cultural diplomacy in India and helped steer the way with UNESCO, and this was the British Council. What is very interesting is that the British Council is very well aware of UNESCO's efforts in India, but at the same time, the British Council is really thinking about British-UK relations in a post-colonial context. Founded in 1934, British Council became actively involved in India to promote British culture, support Indian students visiting Britain, promote and teach the English language across India, and support the arts, including industrial design. It is in these papers that there's a distinguishing of these terms, so there's a distinct use of design that emerges. A 1948 report outlines the reasons for the British Council's work in India. Part of the reason was to maintain good relations between Britain and India. On regular occasions, reports, correspondences highlight a paranoia about the opinion of the British held by Indians in comparison to the Americans. Another significant concern was the Indian interest in developing relations with the USSR, as well as the rise of the Communist Party, which was perceived as very dangerous. Therefore, support had to be given and connections had to be made with the cultural networks of India. The main art and design journals, including the Marg magazine, edited by Mulk Raj Anand, and the main art society, namely the All India Society of Arts and Crafts, were among some of the networks where the British Council had frequent exchanges. Now, I just want to turn to some of these documents, which are the British Council papers. And here on the top right, we can see that there is a distinct mention that there is a real problem with Indo-British cultural connections. It's not on an impressive scale, that more needed to be done in terms of connecting with the various cultural organizations in India. There's also a mention of how the Englishman known and feared as an administrator or technician is not well known as a human individual. nationalism with his theory of Indian idealism versus Western rationalism, and brought about a drift away from European culture. So this drift had to be reversed somehow. There's also on the bottom left, the Indian government, it says, is keen to develop knowledge of India abroad. And it also refers to that the fact that British Council needs, and Her Majesty's government, the British government needed to be really utilizing this government stance to increase their relationships with India. And obviously, there's a note that there's Indian interest in UNESCO as well. So within sort of this context, the British Council actually shared an office with the All India Society of Arts and Crafts in New Delhi. And they had in their reports ways in which they could work with the organization, but also how they could loan objects of arts and crafts or replicas, articles and photographs for the purposes of publishing in India. And they started receiving requests for material from various groups of bodies. So there were regular requests from the British Council officials in Delhi to London to increase funds to organize exhibitions to show that the British Council are a cultural organization and really important for India. So they really emphasized in their loan requests the importance of exhibitions, of reproductions of the masters, of ceramics, sculpture, and textiles. And they also had the ambition of planning an exhibition of costumes in 1952 in New Delhi. In 1955, the Tamil Academy requested permissions to reproduce illustrations in the Tamil Encyclopedia and approached the British Council to act as intermediary to museums in London. And they sought illustrations about the V&A, from the V&A rather, on Renaissance ironwork from Germany and other European countries. They were requesting images of metal candlesticks, light holders, and a lectern, and so on, in English bronzes, German brass. So you can see through these requests that the British Council is acting as an intermediary to shape understandings of what Britain has to offer. So there's a very subtle educational, but also a diplomatic practice that we see here. So this is Rooplekha, the Journal of Indian Arts and Crafts Society, and here's a 1955 issue, which is in the British Council archive. And this is a very important one, example, which highlights how images, ideas, and objects and the exchanges between Britain and India, but also India and other nations, were actually presented in this journal. So this became a space where the British Council was sharing knowledge about British art and design. However, in the same journal, we also see images of exhibitions that were held in New Delhi. So here is an exhibition from an image of the exhibition of Arts and Crafts of China, jointly organized by the Chinese People's Association for Cultural Relations with Foreign Countries, in collaboration with the All India Fine Arts and Crafts Society. And this was presented in the Society's gallery in February 1955. Also on display were Russian arts and crafts and the Hungarian folk arts. On display, salt cellar of cattle horn, and on the left, so in the Hungary section, and on the right, we see silver-plated vase with silver engraved. And so what we see is that this gallery keeps coming up in the British Council archives, where they have ambitions to present work. What they also see is that quite often there is a real tension between the British Council stance on an anxiety around India's networks in Russia and the other nations in the Eastern Bloc. Exhibitions with countries from the Eastern Bloc continued. Here's an image of the International Industries exhibition held in Bombay in 1951. And there was a request to the President Rajendra Prasad at the time to inaugurate the International Industries Fair in Bombay in 51. And there's a specific mention that countries from the communist bloc occupied a majority of the exhibits. The president declined due to not being available. It is very, very unclear as to what the actual reason for the turning down of the invitation was. What we see here is an image of the entrance of one of the gates into the fair. And here we see paintings showing agriculture and industry. In another image, we see a central view of the fair showing the Russian stall at extreme left. You can see the Russian flag flying on the left-hand side. In the image on the right, we see the view of the Afghan stall showing the main entrance. What I have also found, and I haven't included the images here, is there is a book that Russia was selling at this fair, which includes lists and lists of exports that Russia had available for not just Russia, the USSR essentially had available for India. And there were essays on the very kind of progressive socialist ambition of Russia and how they were very actively more progressive compared to the capitalist nation. So it is a really excellent example of a really strong presence and propaganda within the space. It's a beautiful object to look at as well. So here is a stall which is a food ministry's exhibition on modern cultivation presented at this exhibition. So what I want to move to here through this example is that in terms of the technological advancement of agriculture, production of commodities, India received development aid from Great Britain as well as the United States in this period significantly through national overseas development programs and also specific targeted projects by the World Bank. In the turn of the decades of the 40s, reports from Britain on India's needs and projections for improvement were multifold. That India had a significant problem of a growing population keeps coming up, that resource needs needed to be met, and that limited infrastructure on the one hand, and on the other, there was a rhetoric that Indian workers did not work hard enough, and speculation included inadequate calorie intake. So Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, who was the deputy PM for Nehru, declared an economic emergency. The United Kingdom's Foreign Office and officials from the Bank of England overseas funding arm debated on what support needed to be provided to India. And so, therefore, food production was very important. However, what we also see at this time is that the World Bank is arguing that India is a very risky nation to be investing in because it would not be able to repay its loans. And then subsequently, a paper emerges that defies this position. This was a British paper saying that we must help India, and then the World Bank takes away its word and then continues to further its support. Now, the reason why all this context is really important is that because at the same time, India is positing itself through reports where it is actively showing that there is a great advancement of technology, and companies such as the Tata Industries Limited is presented not just in the text, so for example in essays, so this is the Economist newspaper, but also through advertising, that India has much to offer, and that and that if economically developed, it would be from the British perspective, that if India was supported, then it would become a very important market for Great Britain and a consumer of British goods. So India also had manufacturing potential, as we know, as presented here. And for Britain and for India in this period, what we see is a real attempt at creating some kind of a trust, particularly from Britain, because so many British companies had withdrawn from India following independence. And so the British government is really trying to have conversations with the Indian government, and some of the ways in which these are playing out is to invest in capital projects, because India had iron, India had steel, aluminium, and these were very important for as raw material for industry and for commodity production. And crucial to India's progress was the private industrial sector. So a report in The Economist celebrated India's move away from socialism, despite Nehru being a socialist, and realism and pragmatism were becoming important aspects of state policy. So while the handloom industry was celebrated and there was a notable increase in production here, the handloom worker earned little, and this industry was seen as still fledgling. So within this context, India was regularly active in shaping the economic narrative, as well as staging exhibitions, undertaking cultural diplomacy, and planning for modernizing projects, as well as arguing for better investment in certain areas. In 1956, at a UNESCO annual conference, a subsidy of £25,000 was promised. And so this was for the purchase of a number of television sets from Philips India, and a 500 watts transmitter and accessories such as 2 television cameras and 30 television receivers that Philips had purchased in 1955 from an industrial exhibition. Now, I don't have the name of this industrial exhibition where this was purchased from. So if anyone here has any thoughts on which that would be, that it would be fantastic to have that conversation. The first televised political speech was by the Indian President Rajendra Prasad, made on 16th of September 1958. Newspaper reports highlighted that he wore a brown coat instead of his white khadi one, as TV cameras were not favorable of white. The president commented on new innovation and how this new medium of the television would create mass contact across India. He, as well as the Minister of Information and Broadcasting, the director of All India Radio, emphasized the importance of this new medium for training and education, and that this medium was an experiment. Commercial TV was not allowed at this point, as it was argued that it would detract from education. So television sets were installed on the 16th of September 1959 for the first live broadcast in various locations in New Delhi, and newspaper reports highlight that there was a scramble for people to come up close and see the images. The TV was seen but barely heard, was one of the headlines of a newspaper article. Yet this was a significant stage in the history of technology in India, which was widely acknowledged. A critical response came from the Hindustan Standard, a Calcutta newspaper, which said that this is like offering cake to a man starving on days to end. The country's communications are poor and in some places non-existent. Illiteracy and lack of infrastructure needed to be addressed first. To offer a few rich a means of entertainment would not help reduce inequality. The argument that the TV would be used for education was even more absurd, as it needed to reach the millions of villagers first. The cost would be prohibitive. So there was a lot of criticism, as you can see from where this is going, and this was across many newspapers. So I'm going to start to conclude over the next sort of 8 to 10 minutes and make space for some questions. So I will start by concluding on the role of the archive in such a research. And I want to think through the processes of research before I can conclude on the findings. So what happens when we look back at a cultural archive? What kinds of meanings do we look for? There could be one meaning, which would be very sort of univocal, without ambiguities or any confusions. The other meanings emerge when an awareness of simultaneous processes and histories come to the fore. So seeing materials, seeing documents from different political standpoints show simultaneity and different historical misalignments or alignments indeed. So drawing upon Said's thinking, Edward Said, who wrote in his book Methodology of Imperialism, he says that the dominant discourse acts as a contrapuntal reading of the archive, so that one of the ways in which we can start to understand what is beyond the kind of dominant discourse is to look at the different ways in which debates are playing out within the archive. So looking for metropolitan histories and narratives. So really looking at what potentially might be seen as a narrative of British-UK relations. But what is found in the archives is that there are so many different voices and there are different histories that are playing out within the detailed aspects of the archive itself. So reading the India public papers and decisions to employ Gandhian perspectives focus on handloom and craft development alongside the construction of major dams and architectural projects. The narrative of constructing a framework in an international sense for the nation to participate in becomes really prominent. So what is the broader narrative? How do we want to present the nation? Emerging from colonialism, nationalism became a mechanism for anti-imperial agendas. Cultural activities such as exhibitions, the travel of cultural figures abroad in conferences, such as at the UNESCO conferences, the role of the embassy as spreading the mission of the Indian state, and finally the advent of the television drives forth the production of an imagined community. Within these processes, there were alliances and drifts. For instance, while UNESCO worked closely with the All India Arts and Crafts Society, amongst the art community in India itself, this was seen as a fractured group and authoritarian in its representation of India. But through these exchanges and processes, approaches to heritage become visible. Heritage both in tangible and intangible senses, as used by the Indian state for diplomacy, reveals that what is perceived as relevant in the present. So what we see here is that the contemporary ideas around cultural practices and processes are really aligned with sort of post-colonial nationalism and the presentation of the nation. Nations have to be imagined, and these imaginings manifest in a variety of forms, including organizations, exhibitions, reports, art and design journals, and mass media. These are constructed through statements and actions that are often symbolic. So what we see here is that heritage is consistently negotiated. So when we look at the State Archive, what is the Indian heritage? How does it need to be presented? What is the story of civilization? And what is the story of past and the present as well? And there is a constant discussion around a blip in civilization because of colonialism, for instance. So within this context of heritage and national identity, organizations such as UNESCO and the British Council were active participants, albeit with particular agendas. Oh, I'm sorry, I just left. Can you see my screen?
Yes, you just need to present.
Yes, apologies. I just pressed a button. There we go. So while India was an active participant in the British Council's work, the very artistic and cultural heritage of India needed to be modernized as per the British Council. So the local languages were seen as a threat, and the English language, British ways, and British arts had to be shared with India. The British cultural export to India would be immensely important to stop the destructive power of communism that India seemed to be under the influence of as per the British Council. And while it was very obviously aligned with the All India Arts and Crafts, we see that there's an anxiety around the participation of the Eastern Bloc with their activities. So the presence and influence of the West had to be maintained. So the colonial relations, the declining influence of Britain, and the disastrous image of Britain following the Suez Canal crisis meant that more work had to be done by the British in India. So through this, we see that India was seen as an important space within the development of the Cold War period. There was a huge emphasis on the ways in which institutions could do some of the work in creating bridges, how institutions had to be modernized, they had to be supported by Britain, and development was a very important tool and the mechanism to create this bridge. So development and funding, the newly development nation state became diplomacy's favored way to keep emerging countries in the third world to model themselves according to the West. So the West supplied grant aid and examples to show how society should work. And so for the colonized states, such as India, development meant reparation. It meant correcting the past wrongdoings. However, what we see here is that it also became used by the elites of the nation states to, you could argue, in a sense, legitimize their rule. And this is the kind of dialogue that you see where in the archives, how art and design can be used in this context. So I've examined how arts, crafts, design, and technology were employed and negotiated in the processes of exchange. There were imports and exports of ideas and things, and these presented dilemmas and agreements, conflict and affiliations. In the case of the British-India relationship, these were really pronounced, as we can see through some of these case studies. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to stop sharing my slides. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Megha. And before I start, starting a conversation with Megha, I just do want to say that this project of global design history, while it remains in its infancy globally, more so in India itself, in the Indian subcontinent, series like these organized by Phantom Hands under the capable hands of Nia and Raghu and hosted at DIC is really invaluable. But thank you so much, Megha, for bringing into perspective your views. Much of the scholarship of the early 20th century writers, such as Kumaraswamy or Habel, has contributed to this perpetuation of the polarization of heritage and modernity on the one hand, and the East-West dichotomy, which to an extent continued to post-independence. Discourses by writers such as, Stella Kramrisch and Partha Mittal. I suppose in relation to, art, architecture, and design, part of the challenge of the Nehruvian vision was to liberate design, in a sense, from its traditional associations, as well as from associations from colonial art education under the British. So to a large extent, I suppose design till the time of independence was promoted as traditional rural village-based crafts and arts. So your inputs on the industrial exhibitions, the new products such as the TV and, the misalignments and dilemmas, thereof are really quite enlightening. I'm curious about, one thing, and I wonder, there's not so much written, there's not much unpacking about the unease that the designers and cultural activists of the 1950s, for that matter, even today's leaders and designers have faced in the negotiation of an identity that attempts to, at one hand, simultaneously embrace a rich heritage and, what they call cultural prowess of the past. I think you also referred to it alongside a rather international neutral style. What are your views on whether, do you think of these as expressions of a certain post-war liberalism, or were they advocating or attempting for a cosmopolitan, a more humane modernism of the type that Tagore, to an extent, was also speaking of? Or was there an attempt to seek an Indian identity that was quite uniquely separate from its past? What would be your views on this, I wonder?
I think it's I think there isn't a single answer, which is why it makes it really interesting. There are different positions in this. There is obviously a clear drive towards thinking about the social good. So it is a kind of post-war liberal perspective on where things could go, where things could be. And this kind of developmental ideology is also existent before independence. How can we become a better nation state? We have been impoverished because of coloniality, and that is part of the kind of nationalist rhetoric as well. So it is definitely, there's a post-war liberal attitude at play. In terms of design, I think there are both things. There's a real drive towards kind of decolonial, what we might now use the word decolonial. So in the decolonizing years, what can we do now to present India as this as a nation which has a cultural past, which has an artistic and an artistic tradition, and I use artistic in its broadest sense, and where can we go from here? So I think what is really interesting in all of the papers that you see from the archive in India, but also when you read reports on UNESCO that Indian diplomats are visiting some of these places, but also people like Ramesh Thapar, who, a very important person who, and his various scholarly friends who are working in the art and design world, are all talking about what is design and how can it be specific to India. What is, and obviously we know that, the discussions that are happening around the establishing of NID, that there is a level of that thinking going on. So I think there are different positions. From the government perspective, it's absolutely about history and tradition. Is pushed in a significant way.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
There's one other question I wanted to ask you, and I know I'm asking you partly because I did read your paper that you'd sent across to me on your work and research on the work of Doshi and Korea, and it sort of draws on what you were just saying about one of the agendas of the new nation was obviously working towards social development, and one of the first few urban and large expressions of national identity in terms of aligning it with larger egalitarian and liberal ideas of modernism is social housing, affordable housing, especially, you mentioned the addressing the increasing population, especially in cities. Now, modernist social housing has never been, quite the success as we'd like it to be globally. And in India, it almost died before it had any real impact, even while we know that Doshi and Otto Kennisberger also has worked on it. In USA, I forget which year it was, but it was in, I think, 70s or 80s, postmodernist theorist Charles Jenks made this very definitive time of death for modernism, attaching it to the demolition of a particular social housing experiment. I do know of at least one disaster of such a nature that happened not very far from BIC. Raghu, you might know of it, the one at Vivek Nagar, where the entire housing project was brought down because nobody was willing to live there. And it eventually probably will get converted to this new form of community project, which is the urban mall sprawl of sorts. Saying so, no, I can't imagine any other country that has such a need for a community-driven, and for want of another word, postmodern social housing that recognize the needs for diversity, character, individuality, and such like that. While social housing everywhere has had a neutral character. I wanted to ask you, what are your views on, say, the works Doshi has done? How successful has that work been in negotiation of both political interests, assertion of national identity, whether collective experiences of community interests and cultural values have been well regarded? I'm just curious about what your views on that. I mean, social housing is so intrinsically connected to the idea of liberal modernism, let's say.
Absolutely. I think if we begin to unpack what people like Doshi and Korea produced, I think it's very, very easy to celebrate their attempts. It's very easy to celebrate their intentions, in what they were attempting to do there. I think there are two ways of thinking. Obviously, I would need to interview the people who live where Doshi lives to actually ask them, what do you think about where you live, and what does that offer you? I think that kind of housing is a perfect example of a beginning of marketization of housing. To be honest, it's not proper social housing. It is, you had to take loans to be able to live in these places. They were purchased. They had a very particular, it was the kind of development that was not for free for anyone. So I think marketization, by the time some of these housing projects really came into existence, were essentially the beginnings of what we call the extreme marketization and the real estate market boom of India that we see today. So I would argue that there is low cost housing available here, but these are not the proper solutions that they describe as they are presenting here, because obviously we are the, and it's not down to the designers, it is down to the context within which they are practicing.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, like when you go to Bombay, most of social housing happens on the roads, when you,
Absolutely.
there's community, there's sharing, there are community spaces. I mean, the chawls themselves sort of seem to do their work.
Exactly.
So thank you for answering those questions. I'm going to pull out a few questions that we've got from the audience. Sandhya Sharad has asked, and I'm going to read that out. Is there any research and studies to understand if any of these diplomatic efforts by the Western world were of any significant positive influence to Indian art and cultural scene? Did these efforts bring any economic betterment to the current handicraft and art and design scene in India?
It's a good question. I think it's a very big question. To answer this probably in a useful way is to really think about the fact that the influence was absolutely 100% there. I mentioned UNESCO's work in India, and UNESCO had funded lots of had spent extensive amounts of money on toing and froing Indian designers across the world to think about design policy and the design curriculum in India. So clearly, whether the influence was positive or negative, that is about how you look at the question. I mean, the positive would be, okay, there were financial benefits. There is better design. India has is one of the industrial producers of the world, a very important one even. So you could actually start to say that, yes, this has been a successful project. But what we can also see is that the more interesting question for me is that through what means do these things happen? Through what means do we start to see a design education policy where the curriculum is really looking at Indian design, Indian typography, looking at the tradition and bringing it into design education? What we are left with in terms of the visuality of design is, where does that come from? And you could say it's negative or positive. I mean, I'm not here to say it's good or bad. What I'm here to say is that this is how it happened, and this is where we are today. I think because India is such a big nation, it's very, we cannot have one answer. We can have good examples and we can have poor examples of design. So I can't answer it in a good or bad way, if you see what I mean.
I'm going to take this question from Mewish Abid. And she says, thank you, Megha, for sharing your views. This is Mewish Abid from Karachi, Pakistan. My question is, can you elaborate, how did you deal with the archives as a methodological approach, while archiving having its very strong roots in the Western academy? Did you come across any moments where perhaps the idea of the archive as a framework could be decolonized as well?
Yes, that's a really good question. Yes, I agree. It is the archive, and I think I showed one of the ways in which the archive can actually be a really useful place to go to, because while it is a formal collection, while it is gathered by the institutions that are in power, what the archive can also show us are the different positions of the different individuals that are participating in that discourse. So what I found was for example, in the British Council archive, the the way to think about a British Council archive is to obviously think that it is a state-related apparatus. It has a particular diplomatic function internationally. But what you see is, while there is paperwork that's being collected and read in the moment, the archive becomes most useful once it's seen in the future. So what we are collecting today as say in the contemporary moment, for us, this is the very obvious way of looking at the world, and this is our worldview today, for example. However, if you about 20, 40, 50 years later, this archive will be speaking on very, very different levels about what could happen. So yes, I agree. I think the framework of the archive most certainly needs to be decolonized. And one of the ways in which we can move beyond the archive is to actually do some of the oral history work in India, some of the field work, the kinds of research that we need to do is to actually go beyond the archive within design history in South Asia, I would say, in the current moment. And I hope to do that at some point, and I hope that colleagues here can do the same. Yeah, it has its limitations for sure.
Here's another question, which is more about the framework of architecture, of how the framework showed up in architecture. And this is from Samir Bajaj. He's saying, thank you so much for the talk. I wanted to know more about how the ideas and framework showed up in architecture, especially with the projects Nehru undertook with city planning. I also wanted to know how it changed in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, I think there's much written about the projects that Nehru undertook in terms of urban planning and architecture, and of course we've got the Chandigarh project to think about as well. I think what is very important to consider here is that one of the major driving forces in terms of thinking about design, in terms of thinking about urban planning, really has gone to the root of what does it mean now to design a new city. And this idea of the utopianism of that moment is very much looking back, looking forward, the Janus faced kind of approach is very interesting. But for me, what is the most interesting aspect is that how does that come about? What are the images that we can see in this utopian idea of the new India? But also, ironically, a lot of the things that are new were actually not new. They were, they had been tried and tested to a degree. So for me, I think urban planning in the Nehruvian sense, like modernism operates, is that it operated through rhetoric, it operated through vocabulary, it operated through images, and perhaps the actual project, as we know, has now been critically examined, is that it wasn't as successful. Chandigarh has got its limitations. So I hope this kind of helps. And this is also what I'm arguing in my paper today, is that there are all these ideas, but then we see that these ideas are challenged. These ideas do not actually manifest in futures that were always imagined or anticipated, or they had criticisms in the moment as well.
Here's a question from Nia Tandapani, and says, I'm curious about how successful the requests through the British Council to spaces like the V&A were, given the museum's own legacies within India. How aligned were the British Council and the V&A on such diplomatic ends? So
now my next job is to go to the V&A and find out. I haven't I haven't done that part of the research. This is work in progress. This is going to be part of a book. But I think from what I can see is that the British Council did actually work quite closely with British cultural organizations, and they were more successful at obtaining illustrations, but really not successful at pulling through exhibitions because there was no budget. Britain was on its knees economically in the post-war context. So the costumes exhibition in 1952 that was under planning did not actually take place. So that is something we do know. But more on some of these kind of British Council V&A relationships once I've done that part of the research. Yeah.
While the US was a bit more successful in bringing their exhibitions to India, as well as, hosting a lot of them.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of segues to the next question from Nadeem, who says, can we say that the British were very successful in their scheme of promoting their cultural / design in post-colonial times as compared to the USSR? And he says, we don't see very much of Russian design influence in current India. And there's a second part saying, wondering if Scandinavian minimalist design concepts was at that time prevalent in India.
Yeah, that's a very good question.
Why didn't the USSR, even though there was quite a lot of sort of, I suppose, cultural exchange, and well, not exchange as much as inputs, I suppose.
Yes, absolutely. I think India looked much more to the United States and Northern Europe than it did, I would say, Britain, and most certainly Bauhaus and so on. But I think in terms of the presence of the USSR, you see significant USSR present actually in exhibitions in this kind of first decade post-independence. And I think there was a lot of industrial exchange for sure. But I would not call that design exchange, but there was a lot of industrial exchange. Certainly in terms of equipment and, farming equipment, and was very much very prevalent. Yeah, it's absolutely was very, very prevalent, and less so with Britain, actually, which is why Britain is, the papers are really showing that there's a real drive towards creating a level of friendship and trust. So we don't actually see Britain being very successful at all, I think, in the first decade in terms of culture and design. But British Council continues to operate in extremely successful ways. There is so much more cultural exchange that has happened over the last, I would say, 20, 30 years even. But perhaps not in the 50s, no.
Yeah. I mean, we used to have a lot of book exhibitions, I know, from the USSR, and but somehow that didn't sort of percolate to further design inputs. And to answer, Nadeem, your second part of the question about Scandinavian design, a lot of the Scandinavian design influence actually came via the US. Through exhibitions such as Design Today in the US and Europe, which actually brought in a lot of work by Scandinavian designers of the minimalist and sort of international style.
Absolutely.
We can have two more questions, I think. One from Monali Singh, who wants to know how to be part of this kind of research.
I would like to know what Manali does, and if you are a student, and you want to undertake a research project of this type, I think it's through what you find. I would say my research, was sparked by looking at a set of images in the Reba archives that were prints made by Doshi's office. And when I saw those, I was thinking, these are fascinating. Why is he producing these? And what is he thinking about his design through the production of this? And that sort of led me to think about the next thing and the next thing. So it is a bit of a research journey that you go on. So if you are a design historian, if you identify as a design historian, and if you are conducting research, think about what you enjoy working on. What are the objects? What are the ideas that you are fascinated by? And you basically start somewhere. Yeah.
So Nia, do we have time for one more question? And Megha?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So we have one last question from Megha Lokgiri, who wants to know about the role of design education in shaping the design landscape of that era. And I'm presuming you mean the 1950s and 60s?
Yeah, I think I would say that design education was still at its infancy. Applied arts were alive and kicking, however. So if you think about design education in the broadest sense, and think about the applied arts and how illustration, typography, all of these skills and techniques were very much present in the art schools, and were being used, actively in advertising. Then of course, if you call, that was very much present in the visual landscape. So I think design education has a big role to play in the design landscape of the era. If you think about design education as producing designers who are going to contribute to industrial design and are going to be, starting design studios, for example, the kind of shaping of the modern designer in India, then I would say it was much, much more at its infancy. But there was so much discussion. If you read the material on the establishing of NID and so on, I think that is all part of the design landscape of the period. Yeah. And obviously a lot of design education happened outside of India. So that had a huge influence on what was going on in India.
Yeah, and I think also design education, which wasn't strictly termed design education in the sense that we globally know it. For instance, the sort of education that was happening at Shantiniketan and Sriniketan, which was of a different nature altogether and could have taken the landscape in a completely different direction if it was sort of, it had that impetus that I wish it had. In a sense.
Absolutely.
So I think that brings us to the end of our questions, right, Nia? And we could close.
It does.
Thank you again so much, Megha, and thank you, audience, for all your questions. I'm going to give the mic back to Nia and Raghu as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think you've already said it, but thank you very much to Megha and to Sarita as well for their time today. And a reminder that the talks that we've had so far are on the BAC YouTube channel as well. And it would be great if the audience would like to continue to engage with the talks through that. So thank you very much to everybody for their time this evening.
Thank you to everyone for the excellent questions and for your questions, Sarita. It was a real pleasure.